So tonight, we're going to continue with chapter 8 of 12 in the book of Daniel. And as stated last week, chapters 1 through 6 talked about the amazing stories that happened to Daniel and his friends while they were in captivity in Babylon. But chapters 7 through 12 is filled with amazing prophecies where God spoke to Daniel in a supernatural way about things that would happen in the future. Now, some of that would take place in Daniel's day, but a lot of it is going to take place in the latter day. It's got like dual fulfillment. So keep that in mind as we go through this. A few things you will notice about chapter 8 as we get started tonight. It's going to resemble a little bit of chapter 7. It'll sound a lot like a history lesson, which I like history. And we're going to focus specifically on the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Antichrist of the end time. Now, I don't know how this sits with all of you. Maybe you had a bad experience with history in high school. But history is simply God's unfolding plan for the ages. It's His story, history, played out through the generations. History not only has a grand stage of world powers and kingdoms and empires, wars and all of that, but history is also very personal because God has a story just for you that's playing out in your individual life. When we see the care and concern that God has for the big picture, it awakens us to the care and concern that He has for the small picture, our individual lives, and how we play into God's plan. So we're going to get started. Daniel 8, there's 27 verses. We're going to start out in verse 1. And it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at first." Don't you love the way King James writes, the King James Bible? "And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was in Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai." Now, when you think of Shushan or Shushan is actually a city that's located in the country of Iran. It's in a Persian city, where Babylon is located in a city in modern-day Iraq. So it's funny how Iran and Iraq, thousands of years, and they're still very much involved in world events today. So this dream happens while Babylon is still securely in power. During the reign of King Belshazzar, if you remember, King Belshazzar was the king who was partying the night that the Medes and the Persians were outside the gate. Not yet the time when the Medo-Persian Empire had conquered Babylon, so it was before that time. These prophecies that take place don't always take place chronologically with what we read in chapters 1 through 6. But Daniel sees this vision where he is in Shushan standing by a river. Verse 3 says, "Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great." So this ram that Daniel sees while he's standing next to a river, this ram has an odd construction about it. One horn is higher than the other. And this ram is pushing in 3 different directions. All right? So, we're all used to seeing cartoons and the fancy graphics that we have in 2021, and in our head we can probably picture a ram pushing in 3 different directions. But in Daniel's time, his brain probably didn't think like that, and this vision was probably very confusing to him and hard to understand. But this ram pretty much did what it wanted. No one could withstand it, and it became great, the verses say. And what does this represent? Now, I could act like I'm going to speculate, but the chapter actually tells us later on what it represents. The ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire. So we have the Babylonian Empire, which lasted somewhere around 70 years. And then next it's succeeded by the Medo-Persian Empire, which lasted nearly 200 years. So this ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and the ram is an icon that was used in Persian motif often to represent their kingdom and empire. In fact, when Persian kings would go to war, instead of wearing their typical crown they would wear when they were back in the palace, they would take a ram's head and they would wear a ram's head over their head. That's how they represented their king in war. The distinction of a horn that was higher than the other on this ram also represents the Medo-Persian Empire perfectly. They were unequal partners. The Median country actually started the empire. They kind of formed the government which made up the Medo-Persian Empire, but it was the Persians that were the stronger people. They ended up overtaking the Medians, and it eventually became just the Persian Empire, not the Medo-Persian Empire. So verse 5 says, "And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him," or anger, "and smote the ram and brake his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him. And there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven." So this vision is becoming pretty entertaining for Daniel here, for his imagination. First, there's this singular ram with one horn that's larger than the other. Suddenly, a goat from the west comes flying into the scene with fury against the ram. And the goat had one horn between his eyes. Now, normally you would think, a ram against a goat. The ram's going to win every time, right? Not in this case, however. The goat triumphs over the ram and tramples him under his feet. Now, what does the goat represent? In verse 21, it tells us the male goat represents the kingdom of the Greek Empire. So to keep this all straight, you have the Babylonian Empire, you have the Medo-Persian Empire, and then you have the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire, his first king, that large horn in the center of his eyes, the first king of the Greek Empire was Alexander the Great. We've all heard of Alexander the Great, right? From a historical perspective, one of the most notable things about Alexander the Great was the speed in which he conquered the world. Alexander the Great was only 28 when he began his quest to conquer. And by 34, he had conquered everything there was to conquer. Verse 5 says this goat flew across the face of the earth, not even touching the ground. So it's speaking to the speed at which the Greek Empire would conquer the Persians. This vision, which happened nearly 200 years prior to Alexander the Great, is a remarkable description of the Grecian Empire. Verse 5, it rose from the west. It happened suddenly with great speed. It had a notable horn, which talks about Alexander the Great. Verse 7 says it moved with rage. Some of the most famous wars in ancient history happened between the Greeks and the Persians. There was a movie just a few years ago called 300 that talked about this very thing, the Greeks fighting the Persians. Now, verse 8, a notable horn which was great. Alexander, of course. The horn was broken. Alexander died at the young age of 32. Again, that took him 4 years to conquer, and right after he had conquered everything, they said he was actually depressed because there was nothing left to conquer. But he died of, they say, alcoholism. Now, the vision Daniel receives is with such precision when it describes the rise and fall of the Grecian Empire that scholars and academics who don't respect the Word of God have no other explanation other than to say Daniel didn't write it. And it was written long after these events occurred. But that's not true. The truth of the matter is that this book was written by Daniel, and God spoke to him in a supernatural way to warn him of coming events of the future. And we would do well to heed the warnings of this book that this book has to offer. This book does indeed come from God. Verse 8 says that the goat waxed very great. Alexander became great not only because of the vastness of the areas he conquered and the speed in which he did it, but he made it his personal mission, his personal obsession to promote Greek culture among every territory he seized. The Greek language, Greek art, Greek architecture, Greek civilization to the entire world. And you know what? He was successful. He did it. The Greek Empire was so effectively spread Greek culture across its empire that the entire Roman Mediterranean world spoke a common language, Koine Greek it's called. But you know, in doing this, he actually prepared the world for the coming of Jesus Christ. Therefore, when Peter on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 stood before thousands of people from all over the world, he could speak to them in a language that they could all understand. He spoke to them in Greek. He gave that message to all those people on the day of Pentecost in Greek. God used Alexander the Great to lay the groundwork for the spread of the gospel. God had his hand on the rise of Alexander the Great and conquering the world, and he used it for his own purposes in order to prepare the world for the coming of Jesus Christ. Verse 9 says, "And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great." Now, when we talk about the little horn, when we said when the main horn was broke, 4 came up in its place. But it says, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great towards the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the hosts of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped on them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced, and it prospered. So earlier we saw that one great horn was broken. That was Alexander the Great, died at the age of 32. And that 4 horns arose in its place. Those were the 4 generals. And of these 4 generals of Alexander the Great's large Greek empire, and I have a slide that I want Jeffrey to put up. I don't know if you got that ready. The first slide, if you can see this, this is Israel area right in there, and above it you've got Greece, and then Europe over there next to Italy, and down here you got Egypt and Africa, and then over here you've got all the Arab countries. And that was the area that Alexander the Greek conquered, all of that. Pretty much the known world at this time. The next slide. After Alexander the Great died, his kingdom, his empire, was divided into four areas, and you can see there's a dark green, there's a light green down at the bottom, then there's a brown, and then sort of a purple over in the Greek area. But there were actually those two larger sections, the dark green at the bottom and the light green at the top. Those were the 2 most powerful sections of the 4, and they were called the Ptolemaic Empire, which was in the south, and the Seleucid Empire, which was in the north. Now, the 8th king of the Seleucid Empire was a guy by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That's a mouthful, I know. This general ruled over the part of the empire that included Israel. He was the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, which is that winter green area there. By the way, this name Epiphanes was a title that Antiochus IV gave himself. It meant glorious, and it had the idea of deity with it. Now the Jews, they sarcastically referred to Antiochus IV as Antiochus Epimanes, which was sort of a play on the word of epiphany, which means madman. And Antiochus was a madman. He was crazy. He was crazy in his hatred for the Jewish people. Verse 11 says that this man exalted himself even to the prince of hosts. Antiochus IV was a very accurate and dramatic fulfillment of this prophecy of the little horn. And if you go to my next slide, the third one on there, I want to show you a coin that was actually minted during the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. And I have on the reverse side of that coin, that little highlighted area there, there's a word there. It's this Greek word right here that I cannot pronounce, but it means Theos Epiphanes, or I'm not even saying that right, Epiphanes, which is most commonly translated as God manifest, or more descriptively, God manifest in the flesh. So Antiochus Epiphanes considered himself a god. Now, of course, he didn't believe in the God of Israel. His god was Zeus. You know, the Greeks believed that Zeus was the almighty God. But Antiochus Epiphanes believed he was Zeus personified. That's how much he thought of himself. And he had it it was the only Greek coin that had that label on it out of all the Greek kings. So much, now this prophecy that Daniel gave about Antiochus IV, when he talks about the little horn, was so precise that, again, critics of the book of Daniel say there's no way Daniel could have written this book. It's just too precise of a prophecy. It had to be written after these events took place. Verse 10 talks about how he exerted his influence toward the south, east, and the Pleasant Land. The Pleasant Land is the area where Israel was. Everybody wanted Israel. Everyone's after Israel even today. It said he murdered other rulers when it says he brought down the stars. He was a terrible hater of the Jewish people. He wanted them to submit to Greek culture and leave the religion of Judaism behind. The worst of this came in December of 168 BC. He had returned from war with Alexandria. Alexandria was down in there below Egypt. He had actually been beaten up pretty good, and on his way back, he seized Israel. He seized the temple. He set up a statue of Zeus in the temple, and he sacrificed pigs on the altar. Pigs, we know, were an unclean animal to the Jews. He brought the pigs' juices, their broth, their blood, whatever, their innards, and he splashed them into the secret places of the altar in the temple. He desecrated the sanctuary with it. And by some historical estimates, Antiochus Epiphanes was responsible for the murder of over 100,000 Jews. This man was an unbelievable persecutor of the Jews and desecrator of the temple of God. Verse 12 says that he cast truth down to the ground, magnified himself as God. He did all this and he prospered. He prospered while doing it. Now, this can drive you crazy sometimes, right? How is it that the wicked seem to prosper? Those that oppose God seem to flourish. We ask ourselves, how can God let this happen? God, please. How can you even let them get to the first base of doing what they're doing? It's within your power to smote these people. But for some reason, they prosper. They flourish. But you know, God says, don't worry, I know what I'm doing. And God had an end for Antiochus Epiphanes, but for a while, it appeared to be he was succeeding, that he was prospering. He appeared to be a winner. So verse 13 says, Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? How long is this going to continue where this man is torturing the people of God and desecrating the temple? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So Daniel hears one saint ask another, how long will this continue? How long will this persecution continue? The desecration of the temple. And the answer comes back 2,300 days. Now, if you do the math, 2,300 days is about 6.5 years. Verse 15 says, And it came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid. And I fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. But he touched me and set me upright. And he said, Behold, I will make thee to know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. Now Gabriel, he appears as a man and tells Daniel that his vision has relevance to the end. Now we know that for a large measure, what we see here in Daniel 8 has already taken place and been fulfilled. It was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes and his persecutions and desecrations of the Jewish people in the temple. And also, if you're familiar with something called the Maccabean Revolt, which took place in 168 through 160 BC, it eventually led to breaking free of the Greeks, and the temple was cleansed. And in fact, in John 22 and verse 10, the Bible speaks of Jesus attending the feast of the dedication in the winter. That feast of the dedication was celebrating the cleansing of the temple. Today they call the feast of the dedication Hanukkah, a Jewish holiday called Hanukkah. But Gabriel speaks to us across the centuries and says, no, Daniel, there's more to it than just what you're seeing. This vision of yours, this prophecy, there's more to it. It speaks of the end. Just as Antiochus Epiphanes rose to power with force and intrigue, so the Bible tells us there will be a final world leader who will do the same. Just as Antiochus Epiphanes persecuted the Jews, so will this final world leader. Just as Antiochus Epiphanes stopped the sacrifice and desecrated the temple, so will this final world leader. And just as Antiochus Epiphanes appeared to be a complete success and prosper in everything he did, so will the Antichrist appear to be a complete success and prosper. The Bible tells us there will be a final world leader who will appear, and it will be in his days that Jesus Christ will come in glory and rule and reign. The Bible also tells us that when this Antichrist comes, he will rule over some confederation of nations. We talked about the 10 kings last week. There will be some kind of connection or inheritance to the ancient Roman Empire. And the Bible tells us that when this ruler comes, he will be seen by the world as a complete winner. He will persecute the Jews. He will persecute God's people. He will put an end to sacrifice and holy worship. This is coming, church. Believe it, this is coming. Verse 20 says, the ram which thou sawest, having two horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king, or Alexander the Great. Verse 22 says, now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. You see, none of these four generals that succeeded Alexander the Great had near the draw and impact that Alexander the Great had. Verse 23 says, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And this power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. For he shall destroy wonderfully and shall prosper and practice and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Speaking of the Antichrist. And through his policy also, he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. He'll stand up against the Almighty, but he'll be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. Now, what's fascinating about these scriptures is that they read equally true of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist in the end days. A particular trait that we see in Bible prophecy is that prophecy often has a near fulfillment and a distant fulfillment. The prophecy of Antiochus is a prelude to the more perfect prophecy of the Antichrist in the last days. Now, if you want to know what this Antichrist will be like, take a look at the life of Antiochus Epiphanes, because he previews it. Verse 23 through 25 goes point by point what we can expect. Verse 26 said, therefore seal up this vision. Now, why did he tell Daniel to seal up the vision? Because it deals with something more than just the immediate future of Daniel's day, but for the very end of times. Now, we certainly don't know who this Antichrist is or when he will appear on the scene. I've heard people make claims or jokes about who the Antichrist is. I remember when Obama was in office, we liked to joke that he was the Antichrist. There were other leaders before him that people tried to call the Antichrist. We don't know who the Antichrist is. Perhaps that person isn't even born yet. Maybe that person is. Maybe it's a little baby right now that someone's cradling at home. That could be the eventual Antichrist. I do feel like the end of the time is near. I can remember as a kid hearing the end of the time is near. But our world is just waxing worse and worse and worse. We thought it was bad back in the 70s and 80s. Look at the stuff we're dealing with in 2020. We have to be close to the end. I will tell you this, one way we will recognize this end-time Antichrist is the world is going to see him as a winner. He's going to be an absolute winner. Someone who, metaphorically speaking, everything they touch turns to gold. Don't think it can't happen. Look how fervently, and I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers, but look how fervently Christians latched on to President Trump. I voted for Trump. But some Christians are just dogmatic that he is the best leader we ever had, and he needs to come back and be the president again. And maybe he will, but you see how easily people can latch on to a personality. Don't you think that could happen someday if this Antichrist comes on the scene? When this world leader comes, he will oppose God's people on every level. Verse 27 says, "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business. And I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it." Now, you see, Daniel's reaction to this vision was not excitement about the great fight between the goat and the ram, or hanging out with Gabriel and Gabriel telling him all this stuff. You would have thought those would have been the things he remembered. But no, his reaction was that he became sick for days. Daniel saw that such a mighty persecutor of God's people was going to come on the scene, and that he would be a man of such great power and success. Sometimes I hear people make comments about the last days as if they're gleeful to see it. And I've heard people I respect say, "Oh, I just wish God would come back." And I know we're fast forwarding through all of that tribulation, and we're looking at the day when God, calls us up to heaven. But there's going to be a tribulation period that some of us may have to go through. In Matthew 24, Jesus described the last days. He said it would be the worst time the world has ever seen. Let that sink in. Our world has seen some pretty bad days, haven't we? World War II, the Holocaust, all those horrible things that we've had to go through, the Depression. We've seen some pretty bad times. But Jesus said in those last days, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. God's going to shorten those days because he's going to have mercy on his elect. This is why it is so important to share this gospel. We all need to become better at sharing the gospel. And I'm no different than anyone else. I have my reservations. Sometime you're at work and there's an opportunity and you don't take it. And it bothers you the whole day that you didn't take that opportunity. We've got to get better at that. That's why it's so important to raise our children to know that nothing is more important than serving God. This is why God and the church should be the number one priority in our lives. I want to be ready when the Antichrist appears. If I'm living when that happens, I want to be ready for it. I want our children to be ready. I want our church to be ready. Daniel ended the chapter by saying, after he rose from being sick, he went about the king's business. Don't you think that's kind of funny? He didn't let spiritual mystery or physical illness keep him from doing his duty. Our interest in biblical prophecy should make us more concerned with the king's business. We should be out doing the king's business. More of it, not less. Knowing prophecy about the end time should give us an urgency about the king's business right now. Daniel further concluded that he was astonished by his vision, that no one understood it. You see, we can read the New Testament. We got history on our side to look at. We know a lot more now based on these two things, history and the New Testament, that Daniel didn't have those things. So for him, it was very confusing. He said no one could understand it. So there's 4 things I want you to take away from this lesson tonight. Number 1, fulfilled prophecy and his amazing testimony to the divine source of our Bible. A lot of people think the Bible is just a book full of fairy tales. But when you see prophecy that took place hundreds of years before the events took place, that is proof. That is legitimate proof that the Word of God is inspired by the Word of God, by God himself. Number 2, God warns us about his last days, this last day world leader. He wants us to be ready so we won't submit to him. Trust me, it'll be costly to resist this man, but it'll be even more costly to go along with him. Number 3, our hearts should ache for this lost world. And I pray that God gives me more of a burden for lost souls. I don't feel the ache that I should feel for lost souls. If we did, we'd be sharing this gospel with everyone we came in contact with. I worry about my family being ready. But what about this world? All these lost people in our world today. We have to learn that it is our job to take this gospel to a lost world. But not just our lost world, but even people in the church. I was just thinking today how all it takes is one generation to quit serving God, to let down the banner, and your whole family line could be lost from that point forward. I would feel horrible if my grandchildren were standing in judgment one day and thinking to themselves, I remember Grandma going to church. I remember Grandma talking about the Holy Ghost. How come that didn't get to me, I don't want to be the line in my family. I don't want to be the spoke in my family line that let down, that had other priorities higher than church. And then when my kids grew up, they had less of a priority on church. And when their kids grew up, they had no priority on church. And then the salvation of our family got dropped because I let down the standard. I'm not going to let that happen, at least with my line. I want to raise my kids to go to church, and I want them to raise their kids to go to church. I think about the unborn grandchildren and great-grandchildren that I may never meet. I hope they're still serving God. My 4th point is we can be ready for the second coming of Jesus Christ if we simply heed the word that is given to us as a result of his first coming, his work on the cross, the plan of salvation he left with his apostles that was preached on the day of Pentecost. Church, this is what it's all about. God gave us a commission. It wasn't to live in big houses. It wasn't to make tons of money. It wasn't to become famous athletes and all those things that we strive to be. That wasn't the commission that Jesus gave us. It was to understand that Jesus Christ provided a way of escape, that we might endure to the end, make it through this Antichrist, and hear him say, "Enter in, my good and faithful," and to share this wonderful gospel with the world. So those are the 4 points I want you to take from our lesson tonight. And again, chapter 7, chapter 8, very prophetic. 9 through 12 is going to be very much the same, so buckle up and get ready for that. I'm learning so much as I go through the book of Daniel, and it's drawing me closer to the Lord. And I hope it's doing the same for you.